April 10, 1942. Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. Steam rises from the docks as a Japanese officer, his white gloves spotless, watches a film reel flicker to life inside a briefing hall. Grainy footage shows an American submarine surfacing in the Pacific, its torpedoes failing to detonate, its captain cursing through binoculars. The room erupts in laughter. Rear Admiral Shunji Izaki leans back in his chair, a cigarette dangling loosely from his fingers. "The Americans," he says with a smirk, "build ships like children play with toys." Around him, officers chuckle. They've all heard the reports. The Mark 14 torpedo, America's standard weapon, often ran too deep, failed to explode, or sometimes circled back to hit its own submarine. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was a joke wrapped in arrogance. The U.S. submarine fleet, thought to be the Pacific's hidden dagger, was in reality a dull blade. Japanese convoys sailed with confidence. Merchant captains joked that even if an American torpedo hit them, it might just bounce off like a fish kiss. But beneath the Pacific, the laughter was fading. Thousands of miles away, in a cramped submarine base at Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Henry "Hank" Munson stood before a workbench scattered with dismantled torpedo parts. He was tired, oil-stained, and furious. For months, his crew aboard USS Silversides had risked everything to get close enough for a shot, only to watch torpedoes misfire, run wild, or leave a bright white trail through the sea, warning every enemy within sight. "Damn things light up the ocean like a parade," Munson muttered, pointing to a schematic of the Mark 14 steam propulsion. The problem was simple but devastating. Steam-powered torpedoes left a bubbling wake across the surface, an unmistakable signature that screamed, "We're coming." Every Japanese destroyer captain knew that white line. They would turn hard, guns blazing, depth charges ready. American submariners called it the death trail. But in the backrooms of the Bureau of Ordnance, a new secret was taking shape, a response born not from pride, but from humiliation. A torpedo that wouldn't hiss, wouldn't bubble, wouldn't announce itself. One that would glide beneath the waves in perfect silence. Its name was the Mark 18. Munson ran his fingers over a prototype shell that had just arrived from the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport. It was electric, not powered by compressed air or steam, but by battery cells encased in steel. There would be no wake. No telltale line. Just the deep hum of an unseen killer. "It looks slow," his engineer remarked. 17 knots, maybe 18. Munson smiled grimly. "Speed's not what kills, son. Surprise does." He didn't know it yet, but this silent torpedo would flip the balance of the Pacific War. Soon, Japanese admirals who once laughed at America's failures would sit in darkened war rooms, stunned into silence as their convoys vanished without warning, struck by ghosts they could neither see nor hear. For now, the Mark 18 was just an idea, a weapon still in testing, unproven, unpredictable. But word of it was spreading through the submarine fleet like a whispered promise. A promise of revenge. As night settled over Pearl Harbor, the USS Silversides prepared for another patrol. Munson climbed the conning tower ladder, the ocean reflecting a dim orange glow from the harbor lights. He paused, gazing eastward toward the open Pacific. "Let them laugh," he said under his breath. "The next time, they won't even see it coming." The calendar flips to June 14, 1943. Newport Torpedo Station, Rhode Island. The shore smells of salt and machine oil, the whistle of the foundry and the clink of metal fill the air. Inside a low-slung lab, technicians in grease-stained shirts cluster around a tank the size of a railroad car. On a crate nearby, stenciled in black, reads, "Mark 18, Electric Torpedo, Confidential." Lieutenant Commander Munson's prototype shell belonged to a long line of failures and tweaks. Here, under fluorescent glare and the furious scribble of engineers' pens, the Mark 18 earns its stripes. A young electrical officer, Ensign Walter Pierce, hooks up test leads to the torpedo's batteries, those dense lead-acid cells that promise quiet motion beneath the waves. The torpedo's electric motor is small and compact, humming with a low, almost domestic, whir when engaged. No steam escapes, no boiling cauldron of propellant. It moves like something alive and discreet. "Stand back," calls Chief Machinist Petty Officer Ramos, the lines on his face carved by years beside boilers and boilers explosions. He watches the test run, eyes narrowed. The torpedo glides through the test tank, a black shadow cutting the mirrored water. No white wake. No telltale turbulence. It's as if a fish slipped by, unnoticed. The men exhale. The room loosens. For them the moment is small, technical, gears and solder and voltage calculations, but for those who have suffered the embarrassment of unreliable weapons it feels colossal. Back in the Pacific, the Japanese Navy's scornful reports still circulate, jokes at cocktail parties, cartoons in newspapers, mocking radio bits about American, glowing, torpedoes. But those in charge of breaking things to make them right, engineers, ordnance officers, submarine skippers like Munson, work in the opposite register. Their conversations are quieter, stubborn. They patch failures into resolve. Each misfire adds pressure, each test that shows hope brings a surge of confidence. By late summer, the Mark 18 moves from tank to sea trials. Trials are a matter of ritual, a target hulk towed behind a surface ship, cameras fixed in watertight housings, officers with clipboards. The Atlantic morning is glass smooth. The Mark 18 slips beneath, and the observers above watch for that line, the white hiss of a steam-driven torpedo. There is none. The hulk's crew never hears the sigh of approach. The cameras catch nothing on the surface aside from the wake of the towing ship. Only the underwater footage reveals the torpedo's slow, inexorable approach and its clean strike. "It's a ghost," murmurs Lieutenant Commander Arthur Beckett of the trial's crew, thumbs white on his clipboard. No wake, no warning. But ghosts in war must also be dependable. Electric motors and batteries are temperamental, especially in salt water under pressure. Designers sweat over insulation, over seals, over the corrosion that eats at contacts. Engineers invent clever rubber diaphragms, epoxy-filled joints, and redundant fuses. They test at varying depths, simulate the shock of launch, and toss the torpedoes into tanks chilled to the Pacific's abyssal temperatures. Word of successful sea trials travels fast through the submarine community. At Pearl Harbor and Fremantle, captains pass the news with the conspiratorial glee of men who have seen what will change their lives. Fleet captains who once cursed the Mark 14 now read detailed reports with a new kind of hunger. The Mark 18 is not fast in headline numbers, its 29-knot variants are slower than some steam torpedoes, but the absence of a wake and the elimination of the telltale white trail are transformative. Submariners who had to calculate shots around an exposed run now visualize approaching in complete silence, the torpedo a private messenger carrying death. Munson himself travels back to Newport to observe the assembly line turning out the first production models. He runs his gloved hand along the torpedo's hull, feeling the rivets and welds, imagining the pressure of deep water wrapping around it like a hand. He studies the gyro settings with the ordnance officers, the gyros borrowed and improved from earlier designs, the exploder mechanisms tuned with a mix of pragmatism and superstition born of too many dud contacts. "You trust it?" Ensign Pierce asks, earnest and young, watching the lines on Munson's face. Munson considers, and then nods. "If it runs true, it'll make a liar out of every Japanese captain who ever mocked us. But trust is not a feeling in this business. It's a test result." In September, a training exercise off the California coast becomes the real proving ground. The USS Silverside slips out at dusk, hull slick as obsidian. Munson's crew moves with a practiced choreography, the periscope ratchets into position, sonar operators listen for prop signatures with grim concentration, and a petty officer prays in his head though he keeps his face impassive. The target is an obsolete freighter repurposed as a practice hulk. It creaks and groans in the swell. The launch is textbook. The Mark 18 leaves the tube without a spit or a hiss, like a thought dissolving into action. Up on the bridge, lookouts strain their eyes for that old white line that never appears. Below, the crew watches the sonar blip shrink and vanish as the torpedo reaches its mark. The explosion is solid, decisive. The freighter lists and begins to sink. On the deck, a handful of officers clap, but there's no drunken laughter, only the sober, almost private satisfaction of men who had been humiliated and were now being vindicated. Across the ocean, the Japanese Admiralty continues to celebrate its perceived edge, until reports begin to come in, fragmentary at first, from merchant captains and convoy escorts. Ships sink in the night with no warning. Lookouts report nothing but black water and the soft hiss of waves. Survivors speak of hearing a muffled thud without seeing any missile or wake. Rumors mutate into dread. Munson reads the first combat report bearing the words he'd dreamed of in the labs: no visible wake. Target struck with no prior detection. The laughter that once echoed in Yokosuka's briefing halls shifts. It doesn't stop at once. Human inertia and the refuge of old jokes run deep, but the tone alters. Ridicule gives way to a cold curiosity as admirals begin to ask questions they had never needed to ask. Why are our convoys found in calm seas without alarm? How do you fight an enemy you can't see coming? For the men who built the Mark 18, the answer was technical and precise: silence plus reliability. For those about to face it, the answer felt like a sentence. November 2, 1943. Off the coast of Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands. The night sea was ink, glossy and still, disturbed only by the soft churn of diesel engines far below. Deep beneath the surface, the USS Drum slid through the black, every light dimmed to red, every word spoken in a whisper. Lieutenant Commander Robert "Bob" Lee leaned over the plotting table, eyes flicking between sonar readings. His crew had been tracking a Japanese convoy for hours, 3 transports, 2 destroyers, moving southwest in tight formation. A perfect target. But a year ago, no sane skipper would have dared approach this close. Back then, every torpedo left a shimmering white scar that betrayed their position within seconds. Tonight, there would be no scar. Lee's XO crouched beside him, whispering, "Target speed, 8 knots. Bearing steady. Range 3,000 yards." Lee nodded. Set tubes 1 through 4 with Mark 18 electrics. Depth, 10 feet below the keel. The crew moved like ghosts, their hands rehearsed. The torpedo room was cramped, the air heavy with oil and sweat. Chief Petty Officer Dalton knelt before the loading hatch, fingers tracing the cool steel of the new Mark 18. "Silent killer," he muttered under his breath, a grin breaking through the tension. In the control room, the red light flickered as Lee adjusted the periscope. The convoy shimmered faintly in the moonlight, silhouettes against a silver horizon. He could make out one destroyer, Ikazuchi. Zigzagging lazily, confident in its invulnerability. "Open outer doors," Lee ordered. A hiss, then silence. Fire 1. Thud. Fire 2. Thud. Fire 3. Fire 4. For electric torpedoes slipped into the sea, vanishing into darkness. No bubbles. No wake. Just quiet. "Time to impact, 50 seconds, the XO whispered, watching the stopwatch. In the periscope, Lee saw nothing but calm water. The destroyer showed no sign it even knew death was racing toward it. Then, the first explosion, muted, deep, and devastating, lit the horizon like lightning trapped underwater. The Japanese transport Toa Maru erupted into fire, its hull cleaved open amidships. A second blast followed seconds later, throwing debris into the air like volcanic ash. "Direct hits," shouted Dalton from below. Cheers erupted through the sub, restrained but fierce, the sound of long-suppressed frustration finally vindicated. But above the waves, chaos reigned. The Ikazuchi swung its searchlights in frantic arcs, cutting across empty water. No white lines, no bubbles, no clue. The destroyer's captain barked orders, convinced the attack had come from a mine or even sabotage. By the time sonar pings reached the drum's position, Lee had already ordered a silent dive. The submarine slipped into the abyss, engines humming softly as depth charges tumbled from above, exploding far from target. For the first time in the Pacific, the Japanese Navy realized something had changed. Over the next weeks, convoy after convoy began vanishing. In the South China Sea, the USS Trigger sank the Kashiwa Maru without detection. Near Palau, the USS Seahorse destroyed 2 cargo ships before the escorts even spotted a ripple. The Mark 18 had turned American submarines from hunters into phantoms. At Japanese naval headquarters in Tokyo, panic began to creep in. Reports from the field spoke of ghost torpedoes, invisible weapons that gave no warning. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, head of the Imperial Navy's operations staff, studied a map littered with red excess. Convoy losses had doubled in just 2 months. He slammed his hand on the table. "The Americans have changed something," he said. "Find out what." But it wasn't just technology, it was psychology. Every Japanese convoy commander now stared into the water with dread, wondering if unseen death waited below. Sailors refused to sleep during night runs. Rumors spread of cursed seas and American submarines guided by demons. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, word of the Mark 18's success spread through the submarine force like wildfire. Crews who had once endured ridicule now carried themselves with renewed pride. Munson, now overseeing operational deployment, received a telegram from Admiral Lockwood, commander of the submarine force, Pacific Fleet. It was short and simple. "The laughing has stopped." The Mark 18 wasn't perfect, it was slower, prone to battery issues, and tricky to maintain, but its silence was unmatched. Japanese destroyers still tried to adapt, setting up anti-submarine nets and intensified sonar sweeps. Yet the ocean was too vast, and the Americans too patient. By early 1944, the Imperial Navy supply lines were collapsing. Fuel convoys from Borneo were shredded, troop transports sunk mid-route, and vital ammunition shipments never arrived. Japan's war machine began starving, not from lack of courage, but from lack of logistics. And it all traced back to a weapon the Japanese once thought a joke. On a cold night aboard the Drum, Lee stood alone on the conning tower deck as the submarine surfaced to recharge batteries. He looked across the empty sea, the faint glow of a burning ship flickering miles away. The Pacific, once ruled by the rising sun, was now a graveyard of twisted steel and silence. He whispered into the wind, "Guess they're not laughing anymore." February 6, 1944. Philippine Sea. The war had shifted. Once, Japanese convoys steamed proudly across the Pacific with flags flying, destroyers bristling at their flanks. Now, they crept through the night like thieves. No lanterns. No chatter. No confidence. Only the steady fear that somewhere, beneath the still surface, an American submarine waited, with its new, invisible weapon. Aboard the USS Tang, Lieutenant Commander Richard "Dick" O'Kane adjusted his periscope as dawn's faint light brushed the horizon. His sub lay silent at 90 feet, stalking a convoy of oil tankers bound for Manila. Through the mist, their silhouettes looked ghostly, fat, sluggish targets burdened with Japan's last reserves of precious fuel. O'Kane's voice was low, calm, practiced. Torpedo data computer set. Tubes 1 through 6, Mark 18 electrics. The fire control party worked quickly, hands slick with sweat despite the cool temperature. Each man knew what this meant. Every gallon of oil in those tankers kept Japan's aircraft and ships alive. Kill the tankers, and you didn't just sink ships, you strangled an empire. Fire 1. The boat lurched gently. The torpedo slipped into the Pacific, noiseless. Then another. And another. Above, there was no sign of danger, no white trail slicing through the water, no telltale hiss. The sea was smooth, the air heavy. Sailors aboard the lead tanker, Nisho Maru, smoked cigarettes and leaned on the rail, unaware that death was moving beneath their hull. At 0548 hours, the first detonation shattered the calm. The tanker's deck erupted in flame, a geyser of oil-fed fire piercing the sky. Within moments, a second and third blast followed. The convoy disintegrated into chaos, ships turning wildly, sailors screaming, the night split by orange light and the crack of secondary explosions. 3 confirmed hits, reported O'Kane's XO, eyes wide in the red-lit control room. Targets burning. O'Kane nodded grimly. They'll never see what hit them. It wasn't arrogance. It was realization. The Mark 18 had done more than destroy ships. It had erased the enemy's sense of control. That same week, intercepted Japanese communications painted a picture of unraveling command. Admiral Manichi Koga, the new commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, received reports of entire convoys disappearing without a distress call. Destroyer captains wrote in their logs about untraceable torpedoes and unheard explosions. The Navy Ministry ordered an investigation into the American silent weapon. But no one could find a countermeasure to something they couldn't detect. By spring, American submarines had blanketed the Pacific. In the South China Sea, the USS Flasher sank 4 ships in a single patrol. The USS Barb ambushed a troop convoy at night, sinking 2 transports before slipping away undetected. The Japanese escort vessels pinged furiously, dropping depth charges into empty ocean. The Americans were already gone, recharging batteries under distant stars. The transformation wasn't just technological, it was psychological warfare on an oceanic scale. In Tokyo, the mood grew darker by the day. At the Naval War College, instructors rewrote defensive doctrines, urging destroyer captains to zigzag constantly and drop random depth charges to scare off unseen submarines. But the strategy only burned fuel faster, fuel that convoys could no longer deliver. The irony was bitter. Japan's submariners had once mocked the Americans' slow, smoky torpedoes. Now they were burning their own fuel trying to fight a weapon that moved unseen and unheard. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. When USS Tang returned to Pearl Harbor, her hull was scarred, her paint stripped by salt, but her reputation gleamed. On the pier, Munson, now a commander overseeing Pacific submarine operations, was waiting. O'Kane saluted sharply. Silent and deadly, O'Kane said with a grin. You should have seen their faces when it hit. Munson's reply was quiet, almost reverent. I've seen enough faces of our own men watching duds. It's about time they felt the other side of it. Both men stood in silence for a moment, looking out across the harbor. Submarines lined the docks like resting beasts, their crews busy with resupply, refit, and quiet pride. The Pacific wind carried the faint sound of hammering and laughter, the laughter of men who had been doubted, now vindicated. That spring, the numbers told the story. Japanese shipping losses skyrocketed, nearly 500,000 tons per month. The Imperial Navy's fuel reserves plummeted to critical levels. Without oil, planes couldn't fly. Battleships couldn't sail. Carriers couldn't launch. The once mighty war machine began to choke. The Mark 18 wasn't a perfect weapon. It still jammed, sometimes malfunctioned in tropical waters, and its electric cells corroded if not handled carefully. But perfection wasn't necessary. Fear did the rest. In every Japanese convoy briefing that year, one new line was added to the commander's notes. Beware silent torpedoes. And for those who had once laughed, that silence was louder than any explosion. July 9, 1944. South China Sea. The convoy was moving in darkness, 7 freighters, 2 escorts, all zigzagging through the swells under blackout orders. Rain lashed the decks, radar screens flickered in static, and the sea smelled of diesel and fear. For hours, Japanese lookouts strained their eyes against the night, searching for that one thing they used to rely on, a faint, glowing line of bubbles cutting through the waves. But the sea gave nothing back. Below them, at 200 feet, the USS Cod prowled silently through the gloom. Lieutenant Commander James Dempsey knelt over the attack scope, his face lit by the ghostly green of instruments. Convoy, bearing 095. Range 1800 yards. Closing, he whispered. His crew barely breathed. In the torpedo room, the air was hot and tense. The men had loaded 4 Mark 18s, each gleaming black, primed, and humming softly from the charge of their batteries. Set depth, 8 feet under the keel. Magnetic exploders armed. Ready, sir. Dempsey raised the periscope, tracking the slow silhouettes above. He could almost feel their arrogance, those convoys that once believed American torpedoes were clumsy, laughable. The same ships that had mocked the Mark 14's failures were now the prey of a new, invisible killer. Fire 1. Thunk. Fire 2. Thunk. Fire 3. The torpedoes slipped into the black like whispers into a cathedral. No wake. No roar. Just water closing silently behind them. Aboard the Japanese escort destroyer Shigeru, Lieutenant Haruto Sato sipped lukewarm tea, squinting through the rain. The convoy commander had ordered reduced speed to conserve fuel. At least tonight is quiet, Sato said. His words had barely left his lips when the first explosion hit. It was not the thunderclap of a surface shell, but a muffled, gut-deep roar. The freighter Kanzen Maru erupted midships, a wall of flame tearing through her holds. Men were thrown overboard. The bridge shattered. Seconds later, another blast, this time from beneath, flipped a transport on its side. Enemy submarine, someone screamed. But, no wake. No wake. The destroyer's sonar men scrambled, listening for the faintest ping. The ocean mocked them with silence. In the control room of the Cod, Dempsey and his crew watched through sonar as the enemy escorts thrashed wildly. Depth charges rained down, explosions rumbling like distant thunder, but they were guessing, firing blind into empty water. Hold depth at 200, Dempsey ordered calmly. Let them waste their charges. An hour later, the convoy was gone, burning wrecks scattered across 20 miles of sea. The survivors floated in oil-slick water, eyes wide, whispering about invisible torpedoes that made no sound, no warning. The Pacific's once proud merchant fleet was learning a new kind of terror, not the fear of pursuit, but the fear of not even knowing they were being hunted. By the summer of 1944, Japan's shipping lanes had turned into killing grounds. The once mighty empire, spread across thousands of islands, found itself starving. Factories ran out of steel. The Navy's destroyers, unable to refuel, rusted in port. And every convoy sent to sea carried the same dread, the unseen enemy below. In Tokyo, Admiral Shigeru Fukudome read report after report of losses that no countermeasure could stop. "Our ships vanish," one captain wrote. "We hear nothing. We see nothing. Then the ocean swallows us." Fukudome's response was cold and brief. "We underestimated silence." Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, Commander Munson, now overseeing the deployment of new submarine squadrons, stood at the edge of the pier as another vessel, USS Tang, prepared for patrol. The crew moved with quiet purpose, veterans of this new, unseen war. Munson lit a cigarette, exhaling smoke into the dawn breeze. "We've turned their laughter into silence," he murmured to himself. The Tang would go on to record one of the deadliest patrols in U.S. Navy history, sinking Japanese ships with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. Each strike a ghost's touch, each kill a whisper in the dark. But the Mark 18 was not without cost. For every victory, there were risks. Its electric battery sometimes vented chlorine gas, forcing crews to fight not just the enemy, but their own weapons' fumes. Some captains refused to mix them with older steam torpedoes, fearing unpredictable results. Yet, even with its flaws, no one doubted its impact. Because in war, silence can be the loudest sound of all. And by the end of 1944, the Pacific belonged to the silent hunters. The warships lay silent beneath the waves, steel giants turned into tombs. For many, the Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the beginning of the end for Japan's navy. But for Admiral Takeo Kurita, it was a scar that would never heal. When he returned to Japan, there were no parades. No medals. No triumphant speeches. He was the man who had turned back, the man who had victory in his hands but let it slip away. Years later, journalists and historians would track him down, seeking answers. One asked bluntly, "Why did you turn away when you had the Americans cornered?" Kurita looked out at the horizon and said quietly, "Because I saw no reason for my men to die in vain." He had watched too many ships sink. Too many young men, barely old enough to shave, burn alive inside their steel coffins. He had seen Yamato, once the pride of Japan, nearly destroyed by the same skies that rained death on his fleet. He knew that Japan's war was already lost, even if his superiors refused to see it. And so, in that moment of impossible choice, Kurita did what few commanders could: he disobeyed the myth of glory. He chose life, even if it meant humiliation. But history is cruel to those who retreat. While American textbooks praise the courage of destroyers like Johnston and Samuel B. Roberts, Japanese historians labeled Kurita's retreat as cowardice. They said he lost Japan's last chance to turn the tide. That his hesitation destroyed the honor of the Imperial Navy. Yet modern analysts, looking back decades later, see something else entirely. They see a man crushed between impossible odds, outdated intelligence, poor communication, and the suicidal expectations of a dying empire. Kurita was not afraid of death. He had already faced it a dozen times. What he feared was waste. A senseless slaughter for an empire that no longer cared for its people. In his silence, there was wisdom. Because sometimes, the bravest act is not to charge into battle, but to walk away from one. After the war, Kurita lived a quiet life in Tokyo. He worked for the merchant marine, keeping to himself, rarely speaking of Leyte Gulf. He avoided interviews and public events, but one story from a fellow officer captured the essence of his burden. At a reunion of naval veterans, Kurita sat in silence as others reminisced about their lost comrades. Finally, someone raised a toast and said, "To Admiral Kurita, the man who saved our lives." Kurita shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I only delayed your deaths." That moment defined him, a commander haunted not by defeat, but by survival. And that's the paradox of leadership in war. Victory is measured in headlines and medals, but the weight of decisions, who lives, who dies, is carried alone. Kurita's story reminds us that history is not written in black and white. It's written in shades of gray, in human choices made under unbearable pressure. The Americans called him the Admiral who turned away. But perhaps he was something else entirely, the Admiral who saw too much. Because when the guns fell silent, and the empire crumbled, only then did the world realize, it wasn't cowardice that made him turn back. It was humanity. And in war, that might just be the rarest courage of all. They called it Kurita's blunder. A failure of courage. A moment of hesitation that cost Japan the war. But history, when seen through the gunsmoke, tells a quieter story. Imagine the scene, November 1945. A lone figure walks the cold streets of Tokyo. Once, he commanded the mightiest battleships on Earth. Now, Admiral Takeo Kurita wears no medals, no rank, only the weight of memory. To his countrymen, he is the man who turned away. But to the few who survived that day at Leyte Gulf, he is the reason they still breathe. The Americans had expected him to fight to the death. Instead, he made the unthinkable choice, to live. To preserve the last remnants of his fleet. To spare the lives of thousands when the empire was already burning. And for that, he was never forgiven. In interviews years later, Kurita said only one thing about that moment. "I felt sorry for my men. I didn't want to throw away lives for nothing." History often celebrates victory, the triumphant, the bold, the ones who never turned back. But in the silence after war, the truth lingers. Sometimes, the bravest act is knowing when to stop fighting. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended Japan's naval dominance. The Yamato would soon embark on its one-way voyage to death. And Kurita, the man once tasked with saving an empire, would live out his days quietly, a teacher at a merchant school. The ghosts of the sea, though, never left him. As you reflect on his story, remember, wars are not just fought with steel and fire. They are fought in the hearts of men forced to choose between honor and humanity. If this story made you see World War II in a new light, the men behind the myths, the decisions that changed empires, subscribe to the channel. Because here, we don't just tell war stories. We tell the truth behind them. This is the story of the admiral who turned back the tide.